With quarter-mile times dropping into the 10 and 11-second range, these so-called street-legal factory drag cars were nothing short of unhinged. Number 7, 1963, Chevrolet Impala Z11. When most people think of a Chevrolet Impala today, they probably picture one cruising low and slow, rolling through the streets as the crown jewel of lowrider culture. And while that image is true, it only tells part of the story. Because back in the early 60s, the Impala wasn't just a boulevard cruiser, it was one of the most powerful production cars in America. Take 1962, for example. That year, Chevy offered the Impala with the now famous 409 cubic inch V8, cranking out 409 horsepower. The engine was so iconic that the Beach Boys even wrote a song about it, but maybe they should have held off, because the very next year Chevrolet dropped an even wilder version, the Impala Z11. This special edition monster came fitted with a dual-quad 427 cubic inch V8, officially rated at 430 horsepower. Only about 50 of these Z11 were built, and they weren't intended for cruising. They were factory-prepped drag cars. On the Strip, they had no problem dipping into the 10-second range, which immediately raised eyebrows. After all, cars running that quick don't usually do it with just 430 horsepower. The truth is, Chevy's rating was almost certainly conservative, while no official dyno sheets or factory records exist to confirm it. Most authoritative estimates put the real output of the Z11's engine closer to 510 horsepower. That kind of firepower was so extreme that it may have even contributed to General Motors' decision later in 1963 to ban engines larger than 400 cubic inches from intermediate cars. In other words, the Z11 might have been a little too good at its job. After all, letting an average driver loose in a car this powerful was practically begging for trouble, and GM wasn't about to take that risk. 1963, Pontiac Catalina Super Duty. Pontiac wasn't about to sit on the sidelines while Dodge, Plymouth, and Chevrolet were building factory drag cars. In 1963, they rolled out their own heavyweight hitter, the Catalina Super Duty. Under the hood sat a 421 cubic inch V8, fed by a pair of Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors. And just like the other factory drag machines of the era, Pontiac went all in on weight reduction. Aluminum and fiberglass panels replaced steel, interiors were stripped bare, and anything that didn't help get the car down the quarter mile was tossed out. But Pontiac didn't stop there. To squeeze every possible advantage out of the car, engineers even drilled holes through sections of the frame itself, shaving off precious pounds. That's how this wild machine earned its nickname, the Swiss Cheese Pontiac. And on the Strip, it lived up to that reputation, blowing past just about anything brave enough to line up next to it. Like so many of its factory drag rivals, the Catalina Super Duty's power rating was famously conservative. Officially, Pontiac claimed 405 horsepower. But there's no way that number tells the full story, because this full-size car was running the quarter mile in the low 12-second range, a feat that would have required well over 500 horsepower right from the factory. And with a little tuning, these cars were even stronger once they hit the track. Only 14 of these Swiss cheese Pontiacs were ever built, making them not just brutally fast, but incredibly rare. Today, they're among the most desirable collector cars of the muscle car era. In fact, at Macomb Indy 2025, one example sold for a staggering $742,500, while another brought in $473,000 at the very same auction. Proof that these cars are as valuable now as they were unbeatable back then. 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. It might sound strange to bring this up after all these centuries, but technically speaking, a thunderbolt doesn't exist, at least not in scientific or meteorological terms. Lightning is the bolt, thunder is the sound it makes, and you don't actually get thunder in bolt form. But then again, the 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt might just be the exception to the rule. This factory drag car roared like thunder and struck with the force of lightning, which makes you wonder if maybe science got it wrong on this one. The name itself comes straight out of mythology. Gods like Zeus and Thor were said to hurl thunderbolts as weapons, and that imagery fits the thunderbolt perfectly, because while it wasn't a myth, it absolutely became a legend. Under the hood was Ford's fearsome 427 cubic inch side oiler V8, officially rated at 425 horsepower. But here's where the science comes back in. Even with all the weight-saving tricks, fiberglass body panels, stripped interiors, aluminum parts, 425 horsepower isn't enough to push a car into the mid-11-second quarter-mile range. The reality? The Thunderbolt was almost certainly making closer to 540 horsepower right from the factory. That figure may not have been officially documented, but the time slips don't lie. This was a car that simply defied its own numbers. Ford built just 100 of these Thunderbolts, and while most were destined for the drag strip, a handful were actually registered for street use. That meant a lucky few drivers got to unleash this godlike machine in stoplight challenges, delivering all the fury of Valhalla to anyone foolish enough to line up next to them. (1965) Dodge Coronet A990. The 1965 Dodge Coronet A990 is often remembered as that odd-looking machine with its wheels shoved out of place, a car that seemed to annihilate anything it lined up against. But there's a lot of confusion and even some misinformation surrounding it. One of the biggest myths is that Dodge shipped these cars straight from the factory with that altered wheelbase. In reality, the modifications were carried out later, either by individual racers or through Chrysler's own underground racing division, what many called their skunk works. What they did was pretty radical. The front wheels were pushed forward by about 10 to 15 inches, essentially ahead of the engine. Meanwhile, the rear wheels were moved about 10 inches closer to the center of the car. This shift concentrated more of the Coronet's weight over the rear tires, giving it tremendous traction right off the line. A huge advantage in drag racing, where grip can make or break a run. With this setup, the A990 launched harder than just about anything else on the strip. Add in Dodge's monstrous 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 under the hood, and the car didn't just take off. It looked and felt like it was being fired out of a cannon. Its stance was so unusual that people started calling it a funny car, a nickname that stuck and eventually evolved into its own official NHRA racing class. On the drag strip, the A990 was every bit as dominant as Mopar's Hemi cars were in NASCAR, and that dominance quickly rubbed rivals the wrong way. Ford, in particular, couldn't stand it. They had already managed to get the 426 Hemi outlawed in NASCAR, essentially kneecapping Dodge's oval track program. But when it came to drag racing, the NHRA wasn't buying Ford's complaints. Instead, Ford took matters into their own hands by banning their own drivers from even competing against Dodge's A990s. Dodge had originally intended to build around 210 of these cars, but most reliable sources agree that the actual number was closer to 101. That limited production only adds to the A990's mystique today, cementing its place as one of the most important stepping stones in the birth of modern funny car racing. (1966 Ford Fairlane 500R Code). After the legend of the Thunderbolt, Ford wasn't ready to walk away from building factory drag cars. They carried the torch into the fifth generation of the Fairlane with another monster, the 1966 Fairlane 500R Code. Just like its predecessor, it came armed with the 427 cubic inch side-oiler V8, packing all the performance that engine had become famous for. Now, on paper, the R-Code doesn't carry quite the same legendary performance record as the Thunderbolt. The only officially documented quarter-mile time ever recorded for it was right at 13 seconds flat. Sure, that's plenty quick for a street car in the mid-60s, but as a purpose-built drag car, that number doesn't exactly scream dominance. And yet, we know from history that the R-Code was a proven winner. Through the 1966 and 67 seasons, the Fairlane 500R Code ruled the NHRA Superstock B and A classes, with big-name drivers like Bill Lawton and Gas Ronda piloting them down the strip. Looking at what other factory drag cars of the era were running, it's safe to say the R Code had to be capable of mid-11-second passes, or quicker. But here's the catch. Unlike most muscle cars of its time, this Fairlane was never available to the general public. Ford only built 57 of them, and they were reserved exclusively for select factory-backed drivers. That makes the R Code one of the most elusive muscle cars of the 60s. Today, maybe 24 are still around, and when one does pop up for sale, collectors go all in. Recently, bring-a-trailer auctions have seen these cars climbing past the $250,000 mark. The fifth-generation Fairlane as a whole has often been overshadowed by other muscle icons from the golden era. But the R Code is proof that it deserves a second look. It was an almost secret weapon of Ford's drag racing program. Hidden from the streets, unleashed on the strip, and now finally getting the recognition it always deserved. (1968) Dodge Hemi Dart. As we've touched on before, Ford wasn't exactly thrilled with Chrysler's 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 when it first appeared in NASCAR. In fact, Ford argued that the engine was simply too powerful, and for a time it was actually banned until Chrysler could meet homologation rules. That meant they had to sell at least 500 units to the public. Chrysler took that challenge seriously and decided to offer the Hemi in nearly every Dodge and Plymouth intermediate model. But there was one car that didn't get invited to the Hemi party, the Dodge Dart. Being a compact, it was left out of the frenzy, and maybe that was for the best. After all, stuffing that much horsepower into such a small car could be borderline dangerous. Still, enthusiasts didn't have to wonder for long. In 1968, Dodge partnered with Hearst Performance to create the Hemi Dart, and the result was every bit as wild as people imagined. The formula was simple, but extreme. Take a lightweight Dart, jam a 426 Street Hemi under the hood, an engine that barely fit, and then strip out everything that wasn't essential to going fast. No rear seats, no carpet, no insulation. Even the fenders were fiberglass, all in the name of cutting weight. The goal was clear: to dominate the superstock drag racing class. On the strip, the Hemi Dart delivered. These cars were capable of running the quarter mile in the low tens, making them some of the quickest factory-backed machines of their era. Officially, they were street legal, but Dodge strongly advised against daily driving one. With only about 80 units ever built, most went straight to racers, but because they were sold through regular Dodge dealerships, a handful inevitably ended up terrorizing the streets. (1968) Plymouth Hemi Barracuda. If the 1968 Hemi Dart was wild, then Plymouth's answer, the Hemi Barracuda, took things just a step further. Built in the same year and with the same collaboration between Chrysler and Hurst Performance, the Hemi Cuda was essentially the Dart's twin, but with a bit more flair and somehow just a touch more speed. While the Dart had that boxy shoebox on wheels look, the second-generation Barracuda Fastback brought sleeker, more aerodynamic lines. Those curves may have been subtle, but they helped shave off precious fractions of a second, making the Hemi Cuda even quicker down the quarter mile. But what really makes the Hemi Barracuda special is how rare it is. Plymouth and Hurst built only 50 of these monsters, 30 fewer than the Hemi Dart. And both cars were so outrageously dominant in superstock competition that the NHRA had to step in and handicap them. Officials forced teams to add weight in an effort to slow the cars down, but even with the extra pounds, the Hemi Barracudas still laid waste to nearly everything in their path. It's a testament to just how brutal the 426 race Hemi really was, with many insiders estimating these cars were pushing close to 600 horsepower in race trim. Now here's where things often get misunderstood. People sometimes think that a car becomes illegal for the street just because it has insane horsepower figures, but that's not the case. What actually disqualifies a car from being roadworthy is the lack of essentials. Things like bumpers, headlights, turn signals, and legal exhaust systems. Surprisingly, the Hemi Barracuda ticked all the right boxes. On paper, it was street legal. But Plymouth made it clear that this wasn't a car for everyday driving. Every example rolled out with a disclaimer sticker in the window that flat out said the car was for track use only. And to add insult to injury, the factory warranty was void from the moment you bought it. Most of these Hemi Barracudas went straight into the hands of Chrysler-backed racing teams, where they became weapons in sanctioned drag racing. But a handful slipped into dealerships, often displayed front and center to lure customers into showrooms. It's hard to say how many ever made it onto the open road, but you have to imagine that at least one ended up in the hands of a daring owner who registered it, ignored the warnings, and unleashed it on the streets. If so, that car would have instantly become the most feared machine in town, the kind of ride that made legends at every stoplight.